Hi everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Bridget Carey, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's conversation that we've got with Dr. Corinne Low. Welcome, Corinne. Corinne is an economist, researcher, and author whose work shines a powerful light on what many of us feel, but often cannot name, that tension of trying to have it all in a society structured in ways that make that promise pretty challenging. I see you've got a new book, Corinne, Having It All. Yep. And so it draws on data, personal stories, and economic insight, I'd say, to explore not just the barriers women face biologically, culturally, and economically, but also what is needed to reclaim time, energy, and joy. So, over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be talking with Corinne about what having it all really means, the myths, the costs, and what practical steps people and institutions can take to make a real change. So, we'll also have time for questions. So, feel free, everybody, to drop any questions in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of Corinne's presentation. So, thanks again for being here, Corinne. And yeah, so nice to have you. I can't wait to have this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and hi everybody. And I definitely want to hear your questions and talk about the things that matter most to you. But I'll just start with like kind of a brief spiel to tell you a little bit about what I uncovered in my research and kind of how I arrived at writing the book. And I sort of both lived this and saw it in my research, and that was how this book came about. And if you kind of see the cover of the book, it's all about how having it all is just like too much sometimes. And so it's all this stuff
Mhm.
that we're, trying to have in our lives. But then you see the, baby is crying and our coffee is spilled and our inbox is overflowing and dinner is on fire, right? So um, that was the life that I was living. I was commuting from New York to Philadelphia. I was the primary breadwinner, but I was also the one doing the majority of the home production. And I just felt like life is impossibly hard. And I feel like I'm failing at everything all at once. Is it just me?
Mhm.
And then
No.
in my role as an economist who studies women's lives, I started looking at the data and I found that it wasn't just me, right? I say it's not in your head, it's in the data that women are kind of in an impossible bind right now because gender roles have converged at work. We're able to take on the same roles as men and have the same ambitions as men in these kind of ever more demanding careers, but they haven't converged at home. So
Yeah.
men are doing about the same amount of housework as they did in the 1970s. And then you
Wow.
add to that the fact that parenting time exploded starting in the 1990s. Moms
Mhm.
today spend twice as much time with our kids as moms a generation ago. And that just
Wow.
sets up an impossible set of circumstances.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yes. We can feel that for sure. That's fascinating. Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. And Bridget, please chime in if you have questions or specific things you want me
Hmm.
to talk about. But I think once you know those statistics, once you know that
Yeah.
this just like doesn't add up, right? That
Yeah.
trying to be this super corporate career woman and this Instagrammable trad wife at the same time, those are two separate full-time jobs and they don't fit
Mhm.
in one 24-hour day. Um,
No.
it gives you permission to try to, carve out and make choices to carve out a life that does work for you. And that's what the book tries to empower women to do. And, that's where I'd love to kind of have an intimate conversation with people who are on to answer your questions about like, what can I do about this bind that I'm facing? But, I think that we so often feel guilty when we try to make things better for ourselves because I think as women, we think getting a good deal for myself means a bad deal for someone else. And I think that's a
Yeah.
real myth. I think that um, there are win-win solutions and, we need to be relentless in pursuing them. And for me, like the biggest cure for my mom guilt was seeing the relationship with my son blossom when I was getting my needs met. So when I
Mhm.
really radically changed my life and I actually moved to Philadelphia to be closer to my job, then I was able to sit down and be patient with him and listen to a story for the hundredth time. And that mattered so much more than the things that I thought mattered. And so,
Yeah.
and I think there's lessons from that in other domains as well,
Yeah.
that I'm happy to go into more. But I think one I'll just
Absolutely.
mention is I know for a lot of us, we're like winning the bread and baking it too. It's the title of one of
Hmm.
my papers where, playing this career role and we're doing so much at home and trying to do everything ourselves. That's a bad deal.
Yeah,
But
oh, yeah,
I
it's
don't think our spouses want to be junior employees at home
mhm.
either. And so, I think one of the things we need to do is promote them to be co-CEOs of the household and really take ownership over the shared work. And, the book has some strategies for doing that.
Great. So when you say having it all, what do you mean by it? I mean, and how has that promise kind of evolved over time, like culturally and economically, would you say?
Well, I think that the key, like women have always, for a long time, I guess, been trying to balance career and family, right? Women have they've been entering the labor force, since the 1960s. And
Hmm.
before that, like actually, a lot of the economy was rural or was agrarian. So women were still sharing the economic burden. So it's kind of a myth that this is like a new problem, right? But I
Yeah.
think what's changed at this moment in time is just how high the expectations are in every domain. And that's why I really highlight this shift towards intensive parenting.
Yeah.
Parenting time started skyrocketing at the same time as Dr. Sears' book on attachment parenting came out. And, it
Mhm.
was a lot of things. It was our greater understanding of child development, which is a good thing that we know that like holding your baby and talking to them are crucial for their development. Um, but there's so many things that we do today that our mothers and mom's generation ago we're not doing. Every mom on this call knows the kind of intensive bedtime routine where you're, you know,
Mhm.
reading stories and you've got like the 10 steps, or if you have an older kid, you're processing the day's highs and lows. And like, I grew up in the 1980s, so my bedtime routine was go to bed.
Yeah. Yeah. Upstairs, off you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with my kids, now it's like, can you give me a massage? And can we just read one more chapter? And, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's, not saying that, but there's got to be a boundary as well. Like it's nice to have all these things, but hang on, they'll still be fine if we don't have the massage every night and we
10
don't do 6 chapters and we don't.
10,000%. And so, I think it's a beautiful affirmative choice to want to give our kids these really important investments. And it's tremendously costly in terms of our time. And it
Mhm.
makes us feel exhausted and depleted. And I think so often what our kids really need is us. They need that time with us to be connected and calm. And if we are not filling our own cup, we can't do that. So
Mhm.
we've got to say, okay, which of this time is really giving me that return and serving my deeper values? And which of it is kind of these social pressures or these expectations or this inability to say no and to feel like I'm worthy of that no, that it's okay for me to set a boundary because I need it for myself.
Yeah.
Um, and so we've got to figure that out. We've got to figure out how to sort out that good time from bad time. And people on this call have probably heard about like non-promotable tasks at work, where people say like you have to not do the office housework and plan the retreat and do all the mentoring. You've got to focus on the promotable tasks, the things that you actually get paid for and that show up on your performance review. And I think the same is true for our parenting. We've got to figure out like what are the things that actually drive value, that actually do build our children's human capital and actually are crucial for their future socio-emotional health, right? Or their
Yeah.
physical health. And what are the
Absolutely.
things that are kind of some of those extras that
Mhm.
they're nice to have? They're nice to have, like the herb garden that I'd love to have on my windowsill, but like I'm going to kill every single time. And in
Mhm.
the book, I talk about throwing out your houseplants, about saying, like, look, when we are in this squeeze of life, we've got to say no to some things.
Yeah.
And there are certainly some of those with parenting, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's the homemade baby food and it's the
Yeah.
dozens of activities that are each in a different direction instead of saying like look you can have one activity per season right or you can
Yeah.
have something 2 nights a week but that's it
Mhm.
we
Oh,
can't drive
especially,
someplace every single night.
yeah, especially if you got more than one child, that adds up to, I've got three, and it was every night of the week there was something, and I'm like, oh, man, it's a lot. It's a drain on, you don't have that sitting down having a meal time that you kind of want to because you're out busy doing stuff. And just
Yeah,
like,
and then
well,
maybe they're missing out on that
yeah,
connected time
yeah,
with you that they really need.
yeah. So what are some of the biggest myths that people have about having it all that your research has busted? would you say there are any myths about, people think that having it all, and actually the research shows that that's a bit of a myth versus
Yeah,
reality?
so there's a lot of myths that I have. I think I'll have one myth that I hear a lot when I present my research is that I think there's a lot of dads who feel like they're doing a lot more
Mhm.
than men did a generation ago. And um, I'll tell you kind of two factors in this myth. One is parenting time, where men
Mhm.
are spending more time than their own fathers. And I think that's where the kind of pat on the back comes from, right? That they're like, they are doing more than their own fathers. But parenting has become so much more intensive for everyone that
Mhm.
women's time has actually increased more, and so the gender gap in the household has actually gotten worse, not better.
Wow, that's
And
interesting.
so I think, again, that's important to know because I think the values are there that men are like, we want to be involved, dads. We want to share this load. And they're just not seeing how big the load actually is, right?
Mhm.
And then I think that also applies to housework time, where people are always shocked when I show that men's time has stayed kind of constant since the 1970s. And um, men will always jump in and be like, but I'm the one who does the plumbing or I'm the one who mows the lawn. And I'm like, yes, absolutely. In the Chinese data, we see that men do more of those tasks,
Mhm.
but they're a really small portion of overall household time. And so
Yeah.
much of the stuff that women do is not the like dramatic, like I'm mowing the lawn, it's highly visible. So
Mhm.
much of it is
Yeah.
I've quietly restocked the diapers and I've made sure that there are clothes that are the correct season and size. And I
Yeah.
organized the play date on my cell phone while I was taking a Zoom call, right?
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
much of that time is invisible. And so to bust some of those myths, my biggest recommendation for people is that they try tracking their time with their partner. And
Mhm.
if you're interested in trying this, if you go to my website, you can, if you order the book, then you get a bonus, which is this time tracking spreadsheet. And you
Oh,
can
wow.
actually try tracking how you spend your time and kind of showing and being able to have some data within your household to show like, oh, dad's time is these nice meaty chunks of like you go off to work and you spend the whole day at work, and mom's time is Swiss cheese because
Yeah.
we're constantly multitasking, we're constantly meeting somebody's needs, and it really is invisible. And I saw a
Yeah.
question come through in the chat about
Yeah.
why caregiving has become so much more intensive, and I definitely want to answer that because I think it's so important. So part of this is like literally just the nascent field of child development that like
Yeah.
if you were born in the 70s or 80s, like we used to think that you could just like throw a baby in the crib and like you could hand them a bottle, right? And you didn't necessarily need to pick them up or talk to them because they can't talk yet. So why would you talk to them? And then you could put your toddler in front of the TV and you could all eat a TV dinner. We didn't, worry as much about nutrition, right? And so
Yeah.
then there's this science of child development that shows, oh, actually, you need to speak 10,000 words a day to your infant, and you need to play with these enriching toys with your toddler.
Mhm.
And the resurgence of breastfeeding and pumping, these were
Yeah.
all things that mothers from our mother's generation were not doing.
No.
And so I think that's beautiful. That's beautiful knowledge of like what it takes to produce a human. And I hope that we're kind of producing psychologically healthy humans that might need less therapy than we do.
Yeah.
Um, but we also have to recognize how costly it is. And part of
Mhm.
the way that I tell people to kind of recognize this is that when you look at how much the costs of childcare have gone up, and everybody kind of is aware of that, that's because our vision of what it takes to care for a human being has changed. That in the 1980s, it was perfectly acceptable, legally acceptable to have 30 infants in a room with one caregiver because everybody had a crib and a bottle. And now we
Yeah.
understand, no, you need this 4-to-1 ratio because the caregiver has to be holding the infants, right?
Yeah.
And so as that's changed, and we can see the price tag when it's, daycare, right? That
Mhm.
same demand has changed for our time and how we parent our kids.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Got it. Phew, it's everything has a trade-off though, like um let's see, there's another question I've got here. Is there in what you studied, how does race, class, marital status, caregiving demands, things like that, how does that change the landscape of what having it all looks like, and or what it costs? I mean, are you, if you're in a different, if you're single, or if you are an older parent, or if you have more children, or if you're in a different class, or you're a different race? Is it, how does that change with, and what are the costs for each of those? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
guessing it's different.
Yeah, so I talk a lot in the book about kind of socioeconomic status and how these experiences differ by that. I think there's some commonalities. There's commonalities like women doing a lot more, than men, right? And the need to
Yeah.
enlist men in sharing that load. But I think for me, because I work in both the US and developing countries, that really shifted my perspective on how I viewed
Hmm.
caregiving. Because in kind of Western feminism, we have this tendency to kind of view um, childcare as just this penalty that like takes away from what we should be doing because we've all internalized this message that we should be maximizing our careers, right?
Yeah.
But in developing countries where a lot of women need to work really to put food on the table, really truly to be able to feed their families, um, they would view it as a tremendous privilege to be able to stay home and take some time outside of their career to really care for their own children and spend time with them. And so I
Yeah.
bristle a little bit on this language of like child penalties to women who take caregiving time, because I think it's really a shift in priorities. And if I saw that you spent less money on alcohol and nights out and at the bar and nightclubs once you had a baby, I wouldn't call that a child penalty in spending. I would call that a shift in priorities. And so part of what the book tries to do is reframe what the purpose and what the objective of our lives is. And I have this term that is from economics, I call your utility function, which is like,
Yeah.
what's your purpose here? What are you maximizing? And economists think of firms as maximizing profit.
Hmm.
Individuals are maximizing utility. And that is the sum total of joy, happiness, and fulfillment over the course of your lifetime.
Hmm.
And when you think about your life that way, then it shifts, the way we think about this trade-off between career and family,
Yeah.
because our family is a direct way of creating utility. It's part of our objective function in life. Our
Hmm.
career is a means to an end because it converts our time into money that we
Yeah.
use to buy things that bring us utility. And so I think there's been a real mistake in a lot of these books that have been targeted at women to just emphasize your career as kind of the sole objective function, right? Rather than
Yeah.
as a means to enrich your overall life in a picture that includes so many other things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so I mean, based on your research, because I know you've done a lot of research on this, and this is fascinating. But what kind of frameworks or thought processes can you help people make better decisions when everything feels like it's competing? Your work and family and well-being. Um, do you have
Yeah,
any
so I
thoughts
think
on that?
I think getting in touch with what your utility function is. And so I tell people to kind of do this little soul searching exercise where you kind of think about, if money were no object, how would I be spending my time and what would my life look like? And that helps
Right.
clarify a little bit like what really brings you value. And you can't necessarily have all those things. You can't have 100% of all of them, but it clarifies what brings you value. And then the goal is to align your time with that. And so if your vision has a lot of expensive things in it, like, oh, I need to drive the luxury car and I need to have these nice clothes, well, then maybe dedicating time to your job makes sense. But when I ask people to do that, soul searching exercise of money's no object, very rarely do women say, like, well, I make sure that I finish up those PowerPoint reports, right? Or those,
Yeah.
presentations for my boss. And that clarifies, our career is not an end in itself, right? So
Hmm.
once you know what you value, then you can go about trying to align your time with it. And that means at home, figuring out how are you making sure you're getting a return or a payback on the time that you're spending. So what really matters, as I said, with your kids and what doesn't. It means enlisting the support of and really the co-ownership of your spouse or your partner. And I have tools in the book to do that. One of them is tracking your time.
Yeah.
And it means letting go of a lot of things where we say, look, Instagram told me that I should be able to do this. I should be able to feed my family this beautiful, effortless, like fresh, plant-based meal every single night. Um, and I just want to clarify that, the women who are selling you that image are lying because
Hmm.
that is their career. And so it
Yep.
is not actually possible to do that with your other full-time career, right? That is their livelihood, is producing this content. And you're just as good at your career as they are at this, right? But doing both of them, actually isn't possible.
Yep.
So I think those are some of the frameworks I give people, and I really find this utility maximization idea to help people, and almost it being your North Star.
Yeah, because we all have different priorities, right? Somebody, sitting and having a massage is huge. That's their number one priority for the week. Whereas somebody else, it doesn't mean anything to them. So I think that's really useful to kind of sit down and go, what's important in my life, despite what they tell me on Instagram I should be doing with my food and my children and my house. So yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Corinne. I see there's another question in the chat there. They say, also curious if your research covers what having it all means slash balancing shared home labor when one or both parents deal with neurodivergence, especially ADHD.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it can be a real challenge. And I hear this, sometimes I hear this more where, um, the it's a female partner who's trying to figure out how to get her male partner to take more on, but then realizing like, well, I'm just better at multitasking. And he kind of struggles to do these multiple tasks, or he struggles to remember things. And so it kind of makes sense for me to take this on. Right. Um, and so I think absolutely it's true that like we need to be accommodating, we need to make space for neurodivergence and for different people's different styles. But I also think that's where ownership comes in,
Hmm.
because I think for a lot of women, we might deal with neurodivergence too, but I tend to more often see that women have said, so here's the system that I have because I know I have to make it work, right?
Yeah,
And so I think if you divide up ownership of tasks and not just execution of tasks, then
right.
you can figure out the system where that person is still able to kind of get that task done. And you establish, what does done look like, to say like, okay, if we say you're responsible for the kids' lunches,
Hmm.
ownership is, it's not I tell you what to do when you pack the kids' lunches. It's you're responsible for getting all the groceries that need to go in those lunches, right? Packing them, and then cleaning out the lunch boxes when they come home from school. So it's that end-to-end ownership that allows somebody to kind of figure out their own systems. Because if you just assign a task within that whole structure, then as women, we're still taking on the mental load. And then we're so exhausted. And often then, if we do have some kind of neurodivergence, it comes out in our work. We're just, our executive capacity is so taxed beyond its limits that we can't really be productive in our work anymore, right?
Yeah.
So you got to give this full end-to-end ownership. And then if that person needs support, right, then maybe there is some kind of coaching that they need to do. Maybe there is some kind of system development that they need to do. Maybe they need to follow some creators on Instagram that are going to give them hacks of how they're going to figure out this system, right? But
Yeah.
owning the whole task is helpful in that. And I think it's also then doing that in a strengths-based way. So,
Hmm.
each partner,
Yeah, I
they're
was
going to
going to
have
say.
things that are kind of more of their strengths, right? And so, assigning those tasks like based on those strengths, but again, not assigning that little small portion of that task, really assigning that end-to-end ownership. Again, if some person is in charge of dinner, right, it's meal planning, it's shopping, it's cooking, and it's cleaning up. It's actually not, just like, okay, I've already meal planned, but I need you to cook this night, because that's how women just end up really overloaded on the mental load. And um like I said, I feel like we sometimes don't accommodate enough ourselves, where we kind of bend over backwards accommodating our partner.
Yeah.
Kelsey, please chime in again in the chat if that didn't resonate with you, if you have kind of a different angle on that, or feel free to just jump in and unmute and join the conversation.
Yeah.
I was
Thanks for that,
just,
Kelsey.
sorry, I was just about to unmute and ask if I could.
Yes.
Um, I actually am on the flip side of that. So I have ADHD, and my husband takes on a lot of the labor that is like traditionally like women coded, like groceries, or like the organization of how finances are managed. And I, something that really resonated with me that you were just saying is like the end-to-end ownership. Because so like I might not be responsible for like the execution of groceries, but I do a lot of the like inputs, um, and trying to break down tasks that way. um, feels really good. And I also find myself even more so feeling um, like since I can't do these things, right? And these Instagram moms are lying to me. It's like they're telling me they're doing all these things, and I'm like, I can't even do half of them, and my husband's doing the other half. like, so yeah.
No, I think you really have to cut yourself some slack, and like that, exactly that, this vision of like your life can look like this, it literally does not add up because our parenting time has doubled, right? So if you have kids, like you are playing with half a deck of cards, And so again, the women who are doing that, who are kind of performing that effortless domestic perfection, that is their career. There's not a trade-off for them between their career and that life, right? So I think just like understanding that that's not what it's going to look like. It's going to be less aesthetic right now in this period of your life where you are so squeezed. And I talk about this period like the squeeze in my book. But second of all, I actually would really encourage you and your spouse to track your time, because I find it sometimes so revealing, because often like dads are doing a lot of the visible execution. And so that's exactly what you said, right? They're dropping the kids off at school, they're cooking the meal, right? But then we see all of the background scaffolding. And so I tell people, like, if you have a Zoom meeting and it's an hour long, but you confirm a play date on your phone and you order Instacart or you do a meal plan, when you track your time, put down work, work, household management for that hour, right? Because that time was split. And I find when people do that, like women are shocked by actually like how much they're doing, how much time they're spending on this. And so it might help alleviate some of that guilt for you, first of all, of feeling like, oh, my husband's doing more, but you might find you're doing like more than you think. And I would say, ask yourself, like, are there efficiency gains? Because maybe that mental load is really like taxing you and therefore making it harder for you to feel like you can complete these other tasks. So are there efficiency gains from like dividing things up more in like this wholesale way where it's like you're end to end responsible for this, and I just have to focus on this more limited domain, so I know success looks like me completing kind of these things that are on my plate, rather than me needing to feel like I'm holding all of these balls at once.
You're welcome, Kelsey. I'm glad we could help. Thank you for the question again. That's awesome. Thank you, Corinne. That was fantastic. So, what would you say to younger women who are just coming into their careers or families' lives now about expectations and self-care and ambition, setting boundaries, and kind of setting themselves up not to fail, you know what I mean? But because a lot of us who have been, and our children are, we're kind of like, oh my goodness, we're in the thick of it now for some of the stuff that the ground rules or the foundations that we laid that were maybe a little bit thick, but we've kind of had to carry some of them through because our kids and our spouses and our families kind of expect it. So do you have any advice for kind of the next, not next generation, but the younger families that
Yeah.
haven't quite got into some of these bad habits maybe that some of us have got into?
Yes, so much, and more than I can go into right now. But I would say for for looking at a partner, I think we interview for the wrong position when we choose a partner. We tend to interview for the position of boyfriend when we need to be interviewing for that co-CEO position. And I encourage people to kind of, it has to be both. Of course, you need to be attracted to the person and you have to have that spark with the person, right? But having a shared vision of what a household and family looks like is going to eliminate so much conflict later on. Because one of the things I hear from my friends a lot is that their husband says he's happy to share half of the work that like kind of he thinks needs to be done, but there's a lot of stuff he quote doesn't care about. And then because he doesn't care, she's the one who ends up doing it. And so I call this weaponized indifference. It's the new weaponized incompetence, where, it's like, well, I don't think that one of us needs to get the kids ready for school. I think the nanny should do it. So if you want to do it, then that's your choice, right? I don't know why you drive yourself crazy doing all this meal planning. We should just order takeout. And so then it's your choice that you're spending your time on the healthy groceries and the healthy food, right? I say just let them watch TV, but if you want to play with them, that's your choice, right? And again, now all of that time is on mom's shoulders. And I think a lot of that could be avoided if you do have that shared vision in the first place of saying, and so I encourage people to ask these quote interview questions like, yeah,
Yeah.
how much time are we going to rely on childcare? What's your vision for the type of parent you want to be? Or yeah,
Yep.
what do you think, we should be eating as a family? And
Mhm.
like, how does that get done? What should our house look like? And how does that happen? How do we keep it up? So I encourage young people to do that when it comes to partnership, and there's a lot more in the book. And then when it comes to careers, I think also here too, I think we think about our desires at the moment, right? And we all tend to be present biased. So when we're making some of these choices, we're making them as 20-year-olds. And I don't think we think enough about, well, what does this look like over the arc of my life? And I think there's too many jobs where the prize for the pie eating contest is more pie, where you're expected to give and give and give, and then you make it to that top executive partner whatever level, and then you're still expected to be working 60 hours a week. And I think that's where
Mhm.
women end up leaving, because they're like, this just doesn't add up for me. And so
Yeah.
I think you want to always, when you're making career investments, be making investments in getting like a better time to money conversion rate, because that's going to serve you later in life when time becomes more scarce. When we're early in life, actually, we have the time to invest, and it's important to make those investments. But you have to be making investments with a purpose of kind of like buying yourself a better deal later. And so I think that's a little bit of a shift of how you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think there's also, there's so many unknowns as well when you start having children. You can plan out, so you do the vacuuming and I do the whatever, and then you do the this and I do the that. And then I feel like if you've got some of those basics sorted out, and then when the other things come up, you're like, okay, we just deal with them at once rather than never dealing with them. And then suddenly they're all there. And by default, oh, we're just doing this. And, suddenly it gets to resentment, and there's all sorts of things
Yeah,
that could play out.
I
Would you
think that's
say?
exactly right. And that's like, I think a red flag in a relationship often is kind of like an unequal division right now during the dating phase, because once you have kids, it's like cranking up the difficulty level, right?
Yeah.
And, whatever inequalities are there, they're going to get amplified. And that's what the data shows. And so I
Yeah.
think, we need to work harder to kind of correct that before kids are involved and before that additional complexity is there, and have some of those conversations then.
Yeah, yeah, great. So throughout the data and the challenges, and where do you see hope with this going forward? I mean, what stories, or do you have some examples that have stayed with you as you research the book that you're like, oh, this is going in the right direction, or there is hope there, that this
Yes,
isn't how it's going
absolutely.
to be?
And by the way, everybody, like, I love just talking about your individual challenges. So if you have others of
Yeah,
those,
feel
please
free to,
chime in,
yeah.
and we'll workshop them right now. But yes, I think that I see hope for two reasons. One, because my book is empowering women to make changes themselves without waiting for permission from anyone. Because we might be in an environment where we're like, well, I don't know if this policy change is coming. Like, I can't wait for like paid parental leave and universal childcare and things like that to save me, right? And so the book empowers you to kind of reclaim your time yourself, and without waiting for anybody else. And so I see hope because I hear women tell me that they've implemented these changes, and the amount of like space and mental energy that it's given them back. So I think there's just so much that we can do ourselves. But the other place that I see hope is that I think when we talk about the like male loneliness epidemic, and then there's also like falling fertility and marriage rates, right? And I think these things are linked, because I think men are almost feeling alienated right now because they've been displaced in their role as just the traditional breadwinner, but they haven't learned to take on these new roles. So,
Mhm.
with the same way women have learned to go into the labor market and we can play that role, men haven't found this other role that kind of complements their role as breadwinner. And so
Yeah,
then in relationships, I think they're still expecting that old model where, well, she's just grateful that you have a paycheck. And they're finding that that's not enough anymore because she has her own paycheck. But the
yeah,
hope is, and the reason I see hope is that I think men are yearning for connection too. Men want good and sustained relationships. They want to get and they want to stay married. And so I think that they are going to have to evolve. And I think that, um, you know, they I think that they actually do want to be different. And I have a lot of faith in that, in changing our relationships and transforming them. And as I said, like finding partners who can be those co-CEOs of the household. And, I'm also raising a son. And so, in terms of what we can do for the next generation of like really teaching them to value the work of living, that too is economic production, that part of the purpose of your life is this work of living. It's not just to have a prestigious career.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Yay. Gives me goosebumps. So yeah, just a reminder, feel free to put any questions in the chat. I've got a heap here. But if you have your own, asking for a friend or just wanting to know something feel free to, we've got, 10 minutes or so that we've got plenty of time. Let's have a look. So while you were doing your research, was there anything that you came across that kind of surprised you that you didn't expect when you first started your project and you're like, oh, wow.
I think one of the things that really surprised me was that I thought a lot of the gender imbalance was going to come down to parenting time, because I was also kind of living it in my own life and recognizing how much being the birthing parent and being the one who's breastfeeding, like how much that meant that I became the default parent. And so I thought that was going to be a lot of the extra load, and it was, but the inequality in cooking and cleaning was actually bigger. And that was surprising to me. And that showed me that gender and kind of defaults and assumptions was playing a bigger role, because it wasn't like this biological reality that like, oh, I'm the one who gave birth to and is breastfeeding this child. It was this assumption that men got to sort of go to work and not worry about everything else, right? And that women kind of worry about all of these other things. And so that did really change how I looked at things. And that's why I now view it's kind of even more important to like talk about that work of living. That just like, how is food going to get in our refrigerator, and how are we going to buy furniture, and how's the house going to get clean, right? And how does it happen right now? And if you're feeling like those are things that you're struggling with, like in your household and in your relationship, I think it's really having this discussion about values to say, look, do we align on what we want this to look like? Okay, if we align on what we want this to look like, then, and we value it, we have to then be willing to allocate some of our household's shared time or money budget to that getting done. It can't just be me taking on responsibility for it getting done. So either we need a greater contribution of time, or if this is something we really value and we don't think it's worth either of our time, is it something that we can outsource, right? But it's making it like you align on the objective first. You align on like, do we agree that we want this thing, right? Do we agree we want our kids to eat healthy? Okay, now let's figure out how that gets done. And you actually, if that is something you value, you have to be willing to put time or money behind it. It can't just be like magicked up by women, kind of holding things together with our lack of sleep.
Yeah, nice one. How do you suggest somebody handles pushback? So either internally, that mum guilt or imposter syndrome or something like that, or externally from employers or partners or their community, when they try to shift the boundaries to make changes that you suggest that are important. So how do you suggest people handle that kind of pushback?
Well, first of all, I encourage people to kind of look for some of those win-win solutions and to kind of lead with that about why this is kind of valuable to the other person, right? And so one of the inspiring changes that somebody made, like an early reader of my book, was that she had tried moving to the suburbs from the city because she thought it was going to be better for her kids, and they were going to have the big yard that she wanted them to have and that childhood of riding bikes. But she was miserable because now she had an hour-long commute and she had a house to take care of instead of being able to call the super for repairs. She was a New Yorker before that. And so she had that discussion with the kids to say, like, look, I'm exhausted and I'm depleted and I'm not any fun. And I think that if we change the structure of how we're living, that I can spend more time with you and be more fun. And the kids were like, yeah, great. We're on board with that, because that's what we want, right? We want to be able to spend and enjoy spending time as a family versus having these kind of markers of success. So look for the win-win. And I said, with the spouse, it's like, look, this is giving you ownership. This is a good thing, right? But if you do experience that pushback, right? I think you have to give yourself permission for that to be okay, for other people to be uncomfortable, because like
Yeah.
your needs also matter. Like you're a person, you're a member of the household. And
Mhm.
that was one of the biggest mistakes I made in my marriage is I forgot that I was a member of the household. So I was making everything work for everybody else and making sure it added up for everybody else. Um, but I wasn't getting any of my needs met, right? And I was exhausted, depleted. I was a shell of myself. And after, I really changed that situation, I vowed to never do that again, right? To never forget that, like, actually, and I know it's radical and it's scary and you're worried about being accused of being selfish, right? But like to
Yeah.
really think of yourself as the protagonist of your own story. And that doesn't mean not going to meet other people's needs, but it means that it cannot come at the expense of your well-being.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such an easy trap to fall in as a mum, because everybody relies on you. Somebody wakes up in the night or somebody, you know, even the family members around you and it's so easy to fall into that trap and then you wake up years later and you go, hang on a minute. I haven't had a
Yeah.
night off for like 2 years and I haven't seen my friend and I'm going grocery shopping at 10 o'clock at night. How did this
Yeah.
how
And
did
there's
this
an
end
example
up?
in the book where, it's a friend of mine who said that she hadn't been for a run in 4 years since her son was
Mhm.
born. And then I talked to her husband and he's like, oh, I swim for an hour every day. And it's again, where has this gone wrong in terms of the household's joint time and money budget, right? Being invested equally in both people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'd love to
So
hear more questions from our attendees if anybody has
yeah,
one.
feel free everybody. And feel free to unmute and I think everybody can unmute if you want to ask a question that way. Um, but otherwise in the chat is perfect. So while we're waiting, I have a few other questions as well, but how can people get your book and how can they follow you?
Yeah, I would love everybody to go check out my website. I'll put it in the chat right here. I have a newsletter, and if you sign up for my newsletter, you get all these like fun bonuses, like the time tracking spreadsheet, and I have a workbook that goes along with the book. But the book is available wherever you get your books, so it's on Amazon, it's on Bookshop. If you request it at your local library, that's actually great. It's really good for authors. For you to ask for your library to have the book, and it will be there. It'll be in hardback and audiobook, because I know a lot of us don't actually have time to read, but audiobooks are great. And you can follow me on Instagram. I'm Corinne Low, PhD on Instagram, and I love hearing people's stories about how they've put into use the things that are in the book. So I would love for people to continue the conversation, and if you try the time tracking up um, exercise, update me on how that went. I'd love to hear those stories.
That's awesome. Well, if do you have let me check. Did somebody just put something in the chat?
I think that
No,
was
we're
just
good.
me.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Do you have any final words of kind of if somebody said to you, tell me in kind of a sentence or two, what's some of the best advice you could give for having it all in a wrap it up?
Um, I think the mandate to make changes that make yourself whole, that's not optional. So that,
Mhm.
if you find that you're like, okay, my kids are doing great, my husband's doing great, but like I am so bone tired and exhausted, and what you said, like I haven't seen my friends, I haven't done this, right? Um, it's not optional, to take care of yourself, because
Yeah.
our purpose in life is this utility function. It's the experience of our life. And I want you to carve out the life that when you're 85 years old and you're sitting on a rocking chair on the front porch makes you look back and say, like, okay, that was really a life well lived. And so if you're not getting what you need, then it's time to start. It's time to start making changes. And you can start somewhere with the smallest thing. It doesn't have to be an overnight shift. So you can pick one thing to do. And if I could tell everybody on this call one thing that I would want you to do, I would do that picture of, the how you spend your time if money were no object, if you weren't worried about money. And I would really picture some of the stuff that you really enjoy that you would spend more time on. And
Mhm.
then I would have figured out a way to get an extra 20 minutes of that, 3 times a week. So just
Yep.
start there and carve that out. I call it paying yourself first with leisure time. Block it out in your calendar the way you would a meeting with your boss. Nothing can, come before that. It has to happen. Whatever, your husband has to figure out dinner if that's what happens. You have to get a carpool for soccer practice if that's what it takes, right? But you've got to put that first, because when you pictured in your mind, this is how I would spend my life, this is what I want my life to look like, the goal is we're just going to take a tiny baby step towards shifting your life closer to that picture, because we can't put that off. We can't put off living the life that we want until our kids are out of the house. That's not going to work.
No, and I think shifting the guilt as well, and fear, knowing that it's the most selfless thing you could do, giving time to yourself and getting your life back. Because, we're better people when we've had a break and we've had time to rest, and we've had, I know with my kids, I'm much better mum if I've had
Exactly
an hour or two break from them, or, I haven't had, so it's been amazing, Corinne. Thank you so much for coming on today. And thank you everybody who's joined us today and all the questions. And we wish you all the best. And I look forward to following you on Instagram. And I haven't read your book, but I'm going to pick it up and put it on my wish list and get it off Amazon as soon as I can. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. And yeah, please stay in touch. I'm here to workshop and answer your questions. So, and if you go to my website, also I have events in lots of cities and virtual events. So yeah, would love to
Awesome.
engage more. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us
Bye.
today. Bye.